There is a room in the British Museum where objects rest in controlled silence, temperature regulated, humidity monitored, light filtered to prevent degradation of material that has already survived longer than most civilizations. Among these objects is a fragment of clay, roughly the size of a hand. It was pulled from the earth at Larsa, in what is now southern Iraq, in 1876. The fragment is part of what was once a prism, a four-sided column of clay, each face covered in tiny, wedge-shaped marks pressed into the surface before firing. The marks are cuneiform. The text they preserve is a king list. King lists are not unusual in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia. They exist in multiple copies, found at different sites, inscribed at different times. Some are complete, most are fragmentary, and what they share is a basic structure. Cities are named, rulers are assigned to those cities, and lengths of rule are given. The lists function as chronological frameworks. They establish sequence, they assert continuity, they organise the past into manageable units. But this particular king list does something that sits uneasily within conventional historical frameworks. It begins not with the earliest king, whose existence can be verified through contemporary inscription or archaeological evidence. It begins earlier, much earlier, and the way it begins raises a question that has never been fully resolved. The opening line of the Sumerian king list, as preserved across multiple witnesses including the Larsa fragment, reads, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, not invented, not developed, and had not gradually formed through the increasing complexity of social organisation. Lowered." The Sumerian verb is ed3-de3, which carries a sense of bringing something down from above, of transferring something from one level to another. The subject of the verb is namlugal, an abstract noun meaning kingship as an institution, the entire apparatus of centralised rule, authority, administration, and symbolic legitimation. The text does not describe the process by which this lowering occurred. It does not name the agency responsible. It does not explain why kingship needed to be lowered in the first place, or what existed before it was lowered. It simply states that this happened, and then it names the location where kingship first took root: Eridu. Eridu is not a mythical city, it exists. The site is known today as Tel Abu Shahrain, located in the desert of southern Iraq, roughly 12 miles southwest of the ancient city of Ur. Excavations at Eridu, conducted over multiple seasons in the mid-20th century, revealed continuous occupation spanning thousands of years. The earliest levels contained small mud brick shrines, simple structures with altars and offering platforms. In successive levels, these shrines grew larger, walls thickened, rooms multiplied, architectural complexity increased. By the later phases, the structures at Eridu were substantial temple complexes, indicating not only sustained occupation, but sustained cultural memory, the deliberate rebuilding and elaboration of sacred space across generations. The king list assigns the first ruler of Eridu a name, Alulim. It assigns him a length of rule, 28,800 years. And the second ruler of Eridu is named Alalgar. His rule lasted 36,000 years. After Alalgar came a third king and a fourth, though the names and numbers vary slightly across different versions of the list. Some witnesses name 8 antediluvian kings, others name 10. But all versions agree on the basic sequence: rulers in Eridu, then rulers in other cities, then something that disrupts the entire sequence. That something is described in a single phrase: the flood swept over. After this phrase, the text continues. Kingship, it says, was lowered again from heaven. This time it descended not to Eridu, but to Kish, and the rulers who follow the flood are assigned reign lengths that, while still extraordinary by modern standards, are drastically reduced compared to the antediluvian kings. Where the pre-flood kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, the post-flood kings ruled for hundreds. And as the list progresses forward through time, the numbers continue to shrink. eventually reaching durations that align with what might be considered plausible human lifespans. This structure, long rains, flood, shorter rains, has been explained in various ways. Some scholars treat the antediluvian section as pure myth, a symbolic representation of an undifferentiated past before the beginning of reliable record keeping. Others interpret the flood as a literary device, a way of organising cultural memory around a single catastrophic event that may or may not have historical basis. Still others suggest that the exaggerated rain lengths encode some form of astronomical or calendrical information, are a numerical system that has been misunderstood or mistranslated. But all of these interpretations share a common assumption that the antediluvian section of the king list is fundamentally different in nature from the post-diluvian section, that it belongs to a different category of text, that it should not be read as attempting to preserve historical information in the same way the later sections do. This assumption, however, faces a problem. The cities named in the antediluvian section are not invented. They are real places. Eridu, as already noted, corresponds to Tel Abu Shahrain. Bad Tibira, the second city in the sequence, corresponds to Tel al-Madain. Larak, the third city, is less securely identified but is generally associated with Tel al-Wilaya. Sippar, the fourth city, is identified with Tel Abu Haba. Shuruppak, with the fifth and final antediluvian city, corresponds to Tel Farah. Each of these sites has been excavated. Each has yielded material evidence of occupation during periods that conventional chronology places in the 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Why would a mythological text name real cities? Why would it preserve the names of specific rulers associated with those cities, even if the chronological framework is distorted? Why would it insist on a before and after, divided by a flood, if the entire antediluvian section were purely symbolic? One possible answer is that the king list is doing exactly what it appears to be doing, preserving a memory of a period before a major disruption. Not inventing a mythological prehistory, but recording, in the only chronological language available to its compilers, a mere tradition that asserted the existence of organised, centralised settlements before the flood swept over. This interpretation does not require believing that Alulim actually ruled for 28,800 years. It does require taking seriously the possibility that the text preserves information about a time before the flood, that the cities named existed before the flood, and that the institution of kingship, understood as centralised authority with administrative capacity, existed in those cities before the flood. The archaeological evidence, such as it is, does not contradict this possibility. Eridu's earliest levels show organised construction, deliberate site planning, and continuity of religious architecture across many rebuilding phases. Shuruppak, the final antediluvian city in the sequence, has yielded one of the largest collections of early cuneiform tablets ever discovered. Over 1,000 administrative documents dating to the mid-3rd millennium BCE, indicating a functioning bureaucracy capable of tracking goods, labour, and economic transactions. These are not the traces of a society beginning from scratch. They are the traces of a society with established systems. Shuruppak is also the city associated in later Mesopotamian tradition with the flood hero. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the survivor of the flood is called Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, and he is described as a resident of Shuruppak. In the flood narrative embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is called Utnapishtim, and he too is associated with Shuruppak. The king list names the last antediluvian king of Shuruppak as Ubar-Tutu, as some later texts identify Ubar-Tutu as the father of Utnapishtim. Whether this represents a garbled genealogical tradition or a deliberate narrative connection, it establishes Shuruppak as the nexus point, the city where the antediluvian world ended and the post-flood world began. Excavations at Shuruppak, conducted initially by Robert Koldewey in 1902, and later by Erich Schmidt in the 1930s, revealed a stratigraphic sequence that included a thick layer of water-deposited clay separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. The layer was not uniform across the site, and its dating has been debated, but its presence indicates that Shuruppak experienced significant flooding at some point in its history. Similar flood deposits have been identified at other Mesopotamian sites, including Ur and Kish, though the deposits are not always contemporaneous, suggesting multiple flooding events rather than a single catastrophic deluge. Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, uncovered a flood layer approximately 2.5 meters thick. He initially believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis revised this interpretation, recognizing the deposit as evidence of a localized but severe flooding event. Woolley's flood layer at Ur is not the same as the flood layer at Shuruppak. They do not date to the same period, but both indicate that southern Mesopotamia, a region built on the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, experienced repeated episodes of catastrophic flooding. The question then is not whether floods occurred. They did. The question is whether any of these floods were significant enough to function as a cultural boundary. A before and after moment so decisive that it organised the entire chronological memory of the region. The King list suggests that such a moment existed. It places the flood not at the beginning of history, but in the middle. Before the flood, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. After the flood, Kish, Uruk, Ur, and the succession of dynasties that eventually give way to historically attested rulers whose reigns can be cross-referenced with contemporary documents. What the King list does not do is explain how the cities before the flood came to be. It does not describe the invention of writing, the development of agriculture, the construction of irrigation systems, or the emergence of social hierarchy. Or it begins with kingship already established, already functioning, already distributed across multiple cities. The antediluvian section is not a story of origins. It is a record of continuity before interruption. This is where the text becomes strange. Because if kingship was lowered from heaven at the beginning, and if it was lowered again after the flood, the implication is that kingship existed as a concept independent of the cities it inhabited. It was not invented by the people of Eridu. It was brought to them. It was transferred. And after the flood destroyed the cities where it had been established, it was transferred again to Kish, and the process of rebuilding began. The language of descent, of lowering from heaven, recurs throughout Mesopotamian literature. In Sumerian, the term me refers to the divine principles or powers that govern aspects of civilization: kingship, priesthood, music, metalworking, writing, law. These me are not invented by humans. They are possessed by the gods and transferred to humanity under specific conditions. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu to visit the god Enki, who guards the me. After getting Enki drunk, Inanna takes the me and brings them to her own city, Uruk. The me are portable, they can be moved, they can be lost and recovered. The king list, by describing kingship as something lowered from heaven, places it within this same conceptual framework. Kingship is a me. It is not invented. It is given. And the cities listed in the antediluvian section are the places where this me was first established. But if kingship was lowered from heaven, the question remains, lowered by whom? And why to Eridu specifically? The text does not answer these questions directly, but later Mesopotamian tradition provides context. Eridu was the cult centre of the god Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian sources. Enki was the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of magic, and of the underground ocean known as the Abzu. He was the god who possessed the me and who, in various myths, transferred them to humanity. If Eridu is Enki's city, and if kingship was first lowered to Eridu, the implication is that Enki was the one who lowered it. This is not stated explicitly in the king list, but it is consistent with the broader mythological tradition. And if Enki was responsible for lowering kingship to Eridu before the flood, it raises the possibility that the flood itself, described in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood narrative as a divine decision to destroy humanity, was something Enki opposed. In both flood narratives, Enki is the god who warns the flood hero. He tells Atrahasis to build a boat. He tells Utanapishtim to save himself and his family. Enki, in other words, preserves the continuity of human civilization across the boundary of the flood. The king list, read in this light, is not simply a chronological record. It is a record of transfer, interruption, and restoration. Kingship was lowered to Eridu. It was distributed to other cities. The flood disrupted this distribution, and kingship was lowered again, this time to Kish, so that the process could continue. What this implies about the nature of the antediluvian cities is left unstated, but the structure of the text suggests that they were not primitive settlements. They were organised centres of authority, places where the institution of kingship had already been established and was already functioning. The flood did not wipe away the beginning of civilization. It wiped away something that was already developed. This reading does not resolve the problem of the extraordinary reign lengths, but it shifts the focus. The question is no longer whether the numbers are literally accurate. The question is what the compilers of the king list believed they were recording, and the text suggests they believed they were recording a real chronology, however distorted by time and transmission, of a period before the flood when kingship had already been lowered and cities had already been established. The Lhasa fragment, silent and inert in its museum case, preserves this claim. It does not argue for it. It does not defend it. It simply states it, in the same matter-of-fact enumeration it uses for the post-flood kings. Before the flood, Eridu Alulim, 28,800 years. After the flood, Kish, kingship lowered again. The structure treats both periods as part of the same historical continuum. Whether that structure reflects historical reality, distorted memory, or theological conviction is a question the text itself does not answer. But it is a question the text insists on asking. There is a clay tablet in the Louvre, catalogued as AO8196, that contains a different version of the king list. It was acquired in the early 20th century, part of a collection purchased from antiquities dealers operating in Iraq during a period when legal protections for archaeological material were minimal or non-existent. The provenance is uncertain, meaning the exact find spot is unknown, but the tablet's script and content place it firmly within the old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE. This particular witness to the king list tradition is fragmentary, but it preserves portions of both the antediluvian and post-diluvian sections, and its wording differs in small but significant ways from other versions. What becomes clear when comparing multiple witnesses to the king list is that this was not a fixed text, transmitted unchanged across centuries. It was a living document, copied and recopied by scribes who sometimes made errors, sometimes introduced local variations, and sometimes amended the list to reflect the political realities of their own time. The fact that multiple versions exist, however, does not undermine the core structure. All versions begin with the phrase about kingship being lowered from heaven. All versions name Eridu as the first seat of kingship. All versions include a flood that marks a temporal boundary. And all versions resume the list after the flood with a new city and a new set of rulers. This consistency across versions is itself significant. If the antediluvian section were purely mythological invention, one would expect greater variability. Different cities might be named as the first seat of kingship. Different rulers might be assigned to the pre-flood period. Different theological explanations might be offered for how kingship began. But the tradition is stable. Eridu is always first. The flood always divides the sequence. And kingship is always described as something lowered, not something invented. The stability of the tradition suggests that it rests on something older than any individual witness to the king list. It suggests that by the time the earliest known copies were inscribed in the Old Babylonian period, the tradition of antediluvian kingship, centred on Eridu, was already well established and regarded as authoritative. The scribes who copied the king list were not inventing this material, they were preserving it. Preservation, however, is not the same as understanding. It is entirely possible that the scribes of the Old Babylonian period no longer knew what the antediluvian section was meant to represent. They may have regarded it as mythological, in the same way later scholars do. They may have copied it because it was traditional, because it had always been part of the king list, not because they believed Alulim actually ruled for 28,800 years. But they copied it nonetheless, and they copied it faithfully, which means the tradition was valued even if its original meaning had been lost. There is another document, unrelated to the king list but thematically adjacent, that complicates the question of what the Mesopotamians believed about the period before the flood. It is known as the Atrahasis epic, and it survives in multiple copies, the most complete of which is a tablet in the British Museum, catalogued as K3399 plus K3934, excavated from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The Atrahasis text is a narrative, not a list, and it tells a story that begins not with kingship being lowered to Eridu, but with the gods themselves engaged in labour. The opening lines of Atrahasis describe a time when the senior gods, the Anunna, lived in leisure while the junior gods, the Agigi, performed all the work necessary to maintain the cosmos. The Agigi dug canals, cleared rivers, and carried out the back-breaking labour of irrigation and agriculture. This arrangement continued for a long time, the text says, until the Agigi could no longer endure the burden. They rebelled, they burned their tools, marched to the gate of the chief god Enlil, and demanded relief. The crisis was resolved by the god Enki, who proposed a solution: create a new category of being to take over the labour. This being would be called Lulu, which means human or mortal. The text describes how Enki and the birth goddess Nintu fashioned the first humans from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, a god named We'ila, who is otherwise unknown in Mesopotamian mythology. The mixture of clay and divine blood gave humans both physical form and a measure of intelligence. They were created specifically to serve the gods, to take over the agricultural and irrigation work that the Agigi had abandoned. The narrative then skips forward. Humanity multiplies, cities are built, civilization develops. But the rapid increase in human population creates a new problem: noise. The text says that the noise of humanity disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the chief god. Enlil's response was to send a series of plagues to reduce the population. Each time Enki intervened, advising the human hero, Atrahasis, on how to avert the disaster. Finally, Enlil decided on a more permanent solution: a flood that would wipe out humanity entirely. Enki, once again, opposed this plan. He could not prevent the flood, but he could warn Atrahasis. The text describes how Enki spoke to Atrahasis through the wall of a reed hut, instructing him to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and representatives of all living things. Atrahasis did as instructed. The flood came. It lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When it subsided, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis released birds to determine whether the waters had receded. Eventually he disembarked and offered a sacrifice. The gods, who had been deprived of offerings during the flood, gathered around the sacrifice like flies, the text says, hungry and grateful. Enlil, seeing that Atrahasis had survived, was initially enraged, but Enki defended his decision to preserve humanity, arguing that total destruction was unjust. A compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but measures would be put in place to prevent overpopulation. Some women would be barren, some infants would not survive, and there would be priestesses forbidden from bearing children. This new arrangement would maintain the human population at a sustainable level, and the gods would continue to receive offerings without being disturbed by excessive noise. The Atrahasis narrative is clearly mythological. It features divine characters, supernatural events, and theological explanations for natural phenomena. But it shares a core element with the king list, the flood as a boundary event that divides human history into a before and after. In Atrahasis, the before is the period of rapid population growth and city building. The after is the regulated world in which humanity continues under new constraints. The flood does not mark the beginning of civilization. It marks a disruption within an already civilized world. What is notable is that the Atrahasis text does not describe the invention of cities. It does not explain how humans learned to build, to farm, to organise themselves into complex societies. These things are simply assumed to have already happened by the time the narrative reaches the flood. The text begins with the creation of humanity for the purpose of labour, and by the time the flood becomes necessary, humanity is already living in cities and engaging in the full range of civilised activities. The transition from newly created humans to city-dwelling populations is not narrated. It is skipped over. This narrative gap is consistent across multiple Mesopotamian texts that deal with human origins. The creation of humanity is described. The flood is described. But the period between creation and flood, the period during which agriculture, writing, metallurgy, architecture, and all the other technologies of civilization would presumably have been invented, is largely absent from the mythological record. It is as though the texts assume that these things did not need to be invented, or that their invention was not narratively interesting, or that the knowledge required for civilization was present from the beginning. In some texts, this knowledge is explicitly attributed to divine instruction. The god Enki, in particular, is associated with the transmission of civilizational knowledge to humanity. He is called the Lord of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that was believed to underlie the earth. The Abzu was not merely a physical location, it was also the repository of the me, the divine principles or powers that governed all aspects of existence. Writing was a me, kingship was a me, metalworking, and agriculture, law, music, temple building, all of these were me, stored in the Abzu and guarded by Enki. The myth of Inanna and Enki, mentioned earlier, describes how the goddess Inanna acquired some of these me and brought them to her city of Uruk. But the myth does not describe Enki creating the me, it describes him possessing them, which implies that the me existed prior to their distribution to human cities. They were not invented, they were transferred. This framework, divine knowledge transferred to humanity rather than invented by humanity, appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian sources, and it raises a question about the antediluvian cities in the king list. If kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu, and if kingship is understood as a me, then Eridu was the recipient of a transfer of knowledge. And the city did not develop kingship through gradual social evolution. It received it, fully formed, as part of a package of civilizational knowledge. What would this look like archaeologically? It would look like a settlement that appears with relatively advanced organisational capacity from its earliest levels. It would look like architecture that is already deliberate and purposeful, not experimental. It would look like continuity of design and function across rebuilding phases, indicating a stable tradition rather than trial and error. Eridu's archaeological profile fits this description. The earliest temple structures at Eridu are small, but they are not crude. They follow a consistent plan, a central room with an altar at one end and an offering table in the middle. The walls are buttressed, the orientation is consistent, and successive rebuilding phases enlarge the structure but maintain the same basic plan. By the later phases, the temple at Eridu is a massive complex, but it is clearly an elaboration of the original design, not a departure from it. This pattern of continuity suggests that the builders of the earliest temple at Eridu already knew what they were building. They had a template. They were not inventing temple architecture. They were executing it. and they executed it in a way that was deemed successful because the same design was repeated and expanded over many generations. The same pattern appears at other early Mesopotamian sites. At Uruk, the White Temple and the later Iana complex show sophisticated architectural planning, with orthogonal layouts, large-scale construction, and decorative features like cone mosaics, thousands of small clay cones pressed into wet plaster to create geometric patterns on walls and columns. These are not the products of a society learning how to build. They are the products of a society that already knows how to build and is refining its techniques. The conventional explanation for this is diffusion and gradual development. Techniques invented in one place spread to others. Architectural ideas are borrowed and adapted. Over time, experimentation yields successful forms that become standardized. This is a reasonable explanation, and it is almost certainly correct for many aspects of Mesopotamian culture. But it does not fully account for the degree of consistency and planning visible in the earliest monumental architecture. It does not explain why the earliest temples at Eridu already follow a standardized plan, or why the builders of Uruk were already capable of organising labour on the scale required to construct the Iana complex. One possibility, rarely considered in mainstream archaeology, is that the knowledge required for these constructions was not invented in Mesopotamia. It was brought there, not necessarily by gods as the myths claim, but by people who already possessed this knowledge and who established new centres of settlement in the river valleys of southern Iraq. These people would have brought with them not only practical skills, building techniques, agricultural methods, administrative systems, but also cultural memory of where they came from and how their society was organised. This possibility does not require invoking the supernatural. It only requires acknowledging that human populations migrate, that they carry cultural knowledge with them when they migrate, and that the appearance of relatively advanced settlements in a new region does not necessarily mean that all the knowledge visible in those settlements was invented locally. Migration and cultural transfer are well-attested phenomena in human history. There is no reason to assume they did not occur in prehistoric Mesopotamia. The king list, if read as a distorted memory of real events, could be preserving a tradition of settlement by people who already possessed the institution of kingship. They arrived at Eridu. They established kingship there. They extended it to other cities. The flood interrupted this process. And after the flood, the survivors re-established kingship at Kish, continuing the tradition. And this reading does not solve the problem of the extraordinary reign lengths, but it shifts the interpretive question. The question is not whether Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. The question is what that number represents. Is it a distorted memory of a very long period of time? Is it a symbolic encoding of something else? Astronomical cycles, generational counts, dynastic successions? Is it simply an error introduced through repeated copying of an already corrupt text? The text itself offers no guidance. It presents the numbers without explanation, and it presents them in the same format it uses for later, more plausible reign lengths. The implication is that the compilers of the king list regarded the antediluvian section as part of the same chronological framework as the post-diluvian section, and they were not marking a categorical difference between myth and history. They were recording a continuous sequence that extended from the distant past, across the boundary of the flood, into the historical period. Whether this sequence corresponds to real events, or whether it is a theological construction designed to assert the divine origin of kingship, is a question that cannot be answered definitively. But the structure of the text, the stability of the tradition across multiple witnesses, and the correspondence between the cities named in the antediluvian section and real archaeological sites all suggest that the compilers believed they were preserving historical information, however distorted or symbolically encoded. The Louvre tablet, like the Lhasa fragment, does not resolve these questions. It simply restates them, in slightly different wording, with slightly different details, but with the same core claim that kingship existed before the flood, that it was distributed across specific cities, and that it was restored after the flood so that the sequence could continue. What this means for our understanding of Mesopotamian prehistory depends on how much weight one is willing to give to textual tradition in the absence of direct archaeological confirmation. The texts say there were cities before the flood. Archaeology confirms that there were cities and that some of them experienced flooding. The texts say kingship existed in those cities. Archaeology confirms that those cities had monumental architecture and organisational capacity. The texts say the flood was a catastrophic disruption. Archaeology confirms that significant flooding events occurred in the region during the relevant time periods. None of this proves that the antediluvian section of the king list is historically accurate, but it does mean that the text cannot be dismissed as pure myth without engaging seriously with the evidence it presents and the questions it raises. The king list is not simply a theological statement, it is a chronological framework that insists on a specific structure: before, boundary, after. And it insists that kingship spans all three. In the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, there is an object known as the Weld-Blundell Prism. It was acquired by Herbert Weld-Blundell in 1922 from an antiquities dealer in Baghdad and is catalogued as Object 1923.444. The prism is intact, a complete four-sided column of baked clay, standing roughly 20 centimetres tall. Each of its four faces is covered with columns of cuneiform text, inscribed in neat, regular script. It is the most complete surviving witness to the Sumerian king list tradition, and it contains not only the antediluvian section and the post-diluvian dynasties, but also a colophon, a scribal note at the end of the text that provides information about who copied it and when. The colophon states that the text was written during the reign of Utu-Hegel, king of Uruk, who ruled around 2100 BCE, according to conventional chronology. This places the Weld-Blundell prism in the Ur-3 period, several centuries later than some of the fragmentary witnesses, but still ancient by any measure. What the colophon reveals is that the king list was an official document, copied and maintained under royal authority. It was not a folk tradition or a popular legend. It was part of the apparatus of state, a text that legitimated the political order by grounding it in a chronological framework that extended back to the beginning of kingship itself. The fact that the king list was maintained as an official document is important. It means that the rulers who commissioned its copying believed it served a political function. By listing all the cities that had held kingship, from Eridu through Kish, Uruk, and beyond, the text established a model of legitimate rule. And kingship was not something that could be claimed arbitrarily. It had a history. It had been held by specific cities in a specific sequence, and any king who wanted to assert his own legitimacy needed to situate himself within that sequence. The antediluvian section, in this context, serves a specific rhetorical purpose. It extends the history of kingship back beyond the flood, grounding the institution in a time so remote that it precedes any living memory or written record. By placing Eridu at the beginning of the sequence, the text asserts that kingship has divine sanction. It was lowered from heaven, and that it has continuity across the greatest catastrophe known to Mesopotamian tradition. The flood did not destroy kingship, it interrupted it, and kingship resumed afterward because it was a transferable, enduring institution. But if the antediluvian section is primarily a political or theological construct, designed to legitimate contemporary rulers by connecting them to a distant, divinely sanctioned past, why does it include such specific details? Why name 8 or 10 individual kings? Why assign them to 5 specific cities? Why preserve their names? Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi, Ensipazi-ana, Enmendurana, Ubartutu, if those names have no referent beyond theological symbolism? One possible answer is that the names are not invented, but are instead the residue of an older tradition that predates the political use to which the king list was later put. The compilers of the Ur-3 version may have inherited a list of antediluvian kings that was already well established, and they preserved it because it was traditional, even if they no longer understood its original significance. The names, in other words, may be older than the document that preserves them. This is not an unusual phenomenon in the transmission of ancient texts. Scribes often copied material they did not fully understand because it was part of a canonical tradition. The preservation of the text itself was considered important, even if its meaning had become obscure. And if the king list preserves names from a very old tradition, it is possible that those names once referred to real individuals, however distorted their chronology has become through repeated copying and oral transmission. There is a suggestive parallel in the biblical tradition. The book of Genesis includes a genealogy that extends from Adam through 10 generations to Noah, who survives the flood, and then continues with another genealogy from Noah to Abraham. The structure is strikingly similar to the Sumerian king list. Long lifespans before the flood, a catastrophic flood that serves as a temporal boundary, and shorter lifespans after the flood. The Genesis genealogy is clearly influenced by Mesopotamian tradition. The flood narrative in Genesis shares many details with the Mesopotamian versions, but it is presented as a historical record, not as mythology. The patriarchs are treated as real individuals whose lives spanned real, if extraordinarily long, periods of time. Modern scholarship generally regards the Genesis genealogy as a theological construct rather than a historical record. But the compilers of Genesis evidently believed they were preserving historical information. They assigned specific ages to each patriarch. They tracked the number of years from creation to the flood and from the flood to Abraham. They treated the genealogy as a chronological framework that connected their own time to the distant past. Whether or not they were correct, they were clearly attempting to preserve continuity across the flood boundary. The Sumerian king list does the same thing, but with cities and dynasties rather than individuals. It is a political genealogy rather than a family genealogy, but it functions in the same way. It establishes continuity, it asserts legitimacy, and it organises the past into a meaningful sequence. The antediluvian section is not an origin story. It is a preface. It situates the beginning of kingship in a time before the flood, and it implies that the cities named in that section were already centres of organised authority before the catastrophe occurred. If this implication is taken seriously, it raises questions about what those cities were like before the flood. The text provides no description. It names the cities, assigns them rulers, gives the rulers reign lengths, and moves on. But it does not describe their size, their population, their architecture, their economy, or their culture. It assumes that the reader already knows what a city with kingship looks like, and it projects that assumption backward onto the antediluvian period. This is where archaeology becomes relevant, because archaeology can provide at least a partial picture of what early Mesopotamian cities looked like during the periods that might correspond, even roughly, to the antediluvian chronology. And what archaeology reveals is that the earlier cities in southern Mesopotamia were already complex, organised settlements with monumental architecture, evidence of craft specialisation, and indicators of social hierarchy. At Uruk, which the king list places in the first dynasty after the flood, excavations have revealed a sequence of monumental buildings dating to the late 4th millennium, BCE. The so-called Uruk period, named after the site, is characterised by large-scale public architecture, including temples and administrative buildings, and by the appearance of the earliest writing. The writing consists of pictographic symbols impressed on clay tablets, used primarily for administrative purposes, tracking goods, recording transactions, managing temple resources. This is not writing as literature. It is writing as bureaucracy. It is the written record of a functioning administrative system. The presence of writing at Uruk during the late 4th millennium implies not only literacy, but also the organisational capacity to train scribes, to standardise symbols, and to maintain records over time. Writing does not emerge from nowhere. It requires infrastructure, schools, teachers, materials, a class of people whose labour is devoted to record keeping rather than food production. The appearance of writing at Uruk is therefore an indicator of a society that has already achieved a significant degree of complexity. But the king list places Uruk in the first dynasty after the flood, not before. According to the text, Uruk's prominence began after kingship was lowered again from heaven and transferred from Kish. If the flood is understood as a historical event that occurred around the end of the 4th millennium, then the development of writing at Uruk would date to the post-flood period, which is consistent with the conventional archaeological chronology. But this raises the question of what existed before the flood. If Uruk's administrative sophistication is a post-flood development, what level of organisation existed at the antediluvian cities? The king list does not distinguish between antediluvian and post-diluvian cities in terms of their organisational capacity. Both are described in the same terms. A city receives kingship, a ruler is enthroned, the ruler reigns for a specified period, and then kingship passes to another city or another ruler, as the text implies that the institution of kingship functioned in the same way before and after the flood. The only difference is the length of the reigns. If this is the case, and if kingship implies administrative capacity, then the antediluvian cities would have had the same kinds of structures and systems visible at post-flood sites like Uruk. They would have had temples, administrative buildings, workshops, storage facilities, irrigation systems, and all the other infrastructure required to support a centralised authority. They would have had writing, or some precursor to writing, because administrative systems of any complexity require record keeping. Is there archaeological evidence for this? The answer depends on how far back one is willing to push the chronology. If the flood is dated to the late 4th millennium, then the antediluvian period would correspond to the Ubaid period, roughly 5,400 to 4000 BCE. The Ubaid period is characterised by the spread of a distinctive pottery style across southern Mesopotamia, the construction of temple complexes at sites like Eridu and Uruk, and the development of irrigation agriculture. It is not a period of primitive subsistence. It is a period of organised, sedentary communities engaged in complex economic activities. The temples at Eridu, as noted earlier, follow a consistent architectural plan from the earliest levels. This implies standardisation, which implies planning, which implies authority. Someone decided where the temple would be built, how it would be oriented, what materials would be used, and how labour would be organised to construct it. This is not the work of a small, egalitarian community. However, it is the work of a society with leadership, with the capacity to mobilise resources, and with the cultural knowledge to execute large-scale projects. The same pattern appears at other Ubaid sites. At Tel Abada in the Hamrin Basin, excavations revealed a small settlement with a central building that is larger and more elaborate than the surrounding houses. The central building has multiple rooms, storage facilities, and evidence of administrative activity. It is not a temple, but it is clearly a structure of authority. Someone controlled that building. Someone made decisions about how the community's resources would be distributed. This is evidence of social hierarchy. If social hierarchy existed during the Ubaid period, then the antediluvian cities named in the king list could plausibly have had rulers, even if those rulers were not called kings, and even if their reigns were not recorded with the precision the text claims. The institution of kingship, understood as centralised authority with symbolic and administrative functions, could have existed in some form during the period before the flood. The king list, by placing kingship in the antediluvian cities, may be preserving a memory of this social organisation, however distorted the chronological details have become. But there is another possibility, less commonly considered, which is that the antediluvian cities were not contemporary with the Ubaid period, but significantly earlier. If the reign lengths assigned to the antediluvian kings are not purely symbolic, but represent some kind of temporal encoding, perhaps a count of months rather than years, or a count of generations rather than individual lifespans, then the antediluvian period could extend much further back in time than conventional chronology allows. This is speculative, and it is not the mainstream interpretation, but it is worth noting that the text itself treats the antediluvian section as temporally continuous with the post-diluvian section. There is no indication that the compilers regarded the two sections as belonging to different categories of time. They used the same format, the same terminology, and the same enumeration style for both. If they believed the antediluvian section was purely mythological, one would expect some kind of formal marker to distinguish it from the historical section. But no such marker exists. The flood is the only boundary, and it is a boundary within a continuous sequence, not a boundary between myth and history. The weld Blundell prism, standing intact in its display case at Oxford, embodies this continuity. The text flows without interruption from the opening phrase about kingship being lowered from heaven, through the list of antediluvian kings and cities, across the phrase about the flood sweeping over, and into the list of post-flood dynasties. The visual presentation of the text reinforces its claim. This is a single chronological framework, and kingship is the thread that runs through it, from beginning to end. What this means for the question of whether the antediluvian section preserves historical memory is not something the text itself can resolve. The text makes a claim, but it does not provide evidence for the claim beyond its own assertion. The evidence, if it exists, must come from elsewhere, from archaeology, from comparative mythology, from linguistic analysis, from geological studies of flooding events, from any source that can shed light on what southern Mesopotamia was like during the periods that might correspond to the antediluvian chronology. What is clear is that the Mesopotamians themselves took the king list seriously. They copied it repeatedly over a span of more than 1,000 years. They included it in royal inscriptions and temple archives. They used it as a reference point for political legitimacy. And they never, in any of the surviving copies, marked the antediluvian section as fundamentally different in nature from the rest of the list. They treated it as part of the same record, which suggests they believed it preserved information about a real past, even if that past was too remote to be verified. The question, then, is not whether modern scholarship accepts the antediluvian section as historically accurate. The question is why the Mesopotamians accepted it, what they believed it was recording, and whether their belief was based on anything more substantial than theological conviction. And the answer to that question is not obvious because the text provides no explanation. It simply asserts that kingship was lowered to Eridu, that it was distributed to other cities, that the flood interrupted the sequence, and that kingship was restored afterward. The structure of the claim is clear. The justification for the claim is absent. What remains is the claim itself, inscribed on clay, preserved across millennia, and now housed in museums where it can be examined but not fully explained. The weld Blundell prism does not argue for the reality of the antediluvian kings. It does not defend its chronology. It simply states what it believes to be true, in the same calm, enumerative tone it uses for everything else, and leaves the question of interpretation to those who come after. There is a collection of tablets in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, recovered from the ancient city of Nippur, during excavations conducted between 1889 and 1900 under the direction of John Punnett Peters and later Hermann Hilprecht. Nippur was never a political capital in the sense that Uruk or Ur were capitals. It did not house dynasties that competed for regional dominance. Instead, Nippur functioned as a religious centre, the cult city of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. Temples at Nippur received offerings from rulers across Mesopotamia, and the city's scribal schools trained generations of scribes who copied and preserved the literary and administrative traditions of the region. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Nippur are multiple copies of the king list, along with numerous other texts that deal with kingship, divine authority, and the relationship between gods and human rulers. What these texts reveal is that kingship in Mesopotamian thought was not simply a political institution. It was a theological concept. Kings did not rule by their own authority. They ruled because they had been granted the right to rule by the gods, and specifically by Enlil, whose temple at Nippur served as the symbolic centre of legitimate authority. This theological framework explains why the king list begins with the phrase, "when kingship was lowered from heaven." Kingship is not a human invention in Mesopotamian thought. It is a divine gift, transferred from the celestial realm to the terrestrial realm, under conditions determined by the gods. On the lowering of kingship is therefore the moment when divine order is imposed on human society, when the chaos of unorganised existence gives way to the structure of centralised rule. But if kingship is a divine gift, the question becomes, what existed before it was given? What was human society like in the period before kingship was lowered to Eridu? The king list does not address this question. It begins with the lowering of kingship, and it assumes that everything relevant to its chronological framework begins at that moment. There is no prehistory in the king list. There is only the moment when kingship arrives, and the sequence that follows from that arrival. This absence of prehistory is consistent across Mesopotamian literature. Texts that deal with the creation of humanity, such as the Atrahasis epic, describe the fashioning of humans from clay and divine blood, but they do not describe the development of human society. Humans are created, and almost immediately they are engaged in agricultural labour, building cities and reproducing at a rate that disturbs the gods. The transition from newly created beings to a complex urban population is not narrated. It is simply assumed. One interpretation of this narrative gap is that the Mesopotamians did not have a concept of cultural evolution. They did not think in terms of gradual development from simple to complex societies. Instead, they thought in terms of discrete states, a state of non-civilization and a state of civilization. The transition between these states was not a process but an event. Civilization did not develop, it was introduced. This framework is fundamentally different from the developmental models that dominate modern archaeology and anthropology. In modern thought, civilization is understood as the outcome of a long process involving domestication of plants and animals, the invention of agriculture, the establishment of permanent settlements, the development of trade networks, the emergence of craft specialization, the formation of social hierarchies, and the eventual consolidation of political authority in the form of states. Each of these stages builds on the previous one, and the process unfolds over thousands of years. But Mesopotamian texts do not describe this process. They describe the arrival of civilization as a complete package. The me, the divine principles that govern all aspects of civilized life, are not invented by humans. They are possessed by the gods and transferred to humanity. Writing, metalworking, law, temple building, kingship. All of these are me, and all of them are understood as gifts, not inventions. The myth of Inanna and Enki illustrates this clearly. Inanna does not invent the me. She acquires them from Enki, who already possesses them. The me are described as physical objects that can be carried, lost, and transferred. They are treated as pre-existing entities, not as concepts that emerge through human creativity. And once Inanna brings the me to Uruk, her city immediately becomes a centre of civilization. The me are not implemented gradually, they are activated all at once. This understanding of civilization as something transferred rather than developed has implications for how the king list should be read. If kingship is a me, and if me are transferred rather than invented, then the lowering of kingship to Eridu is not a metaphor for the gradual emergence of political authority. It is a description of a specific event, the moment when an already existing institution was introduced to a specific location. Who or what introduced it remains unspecified in the king list itself. The passive construction, kingship was lowered, does not name an agent. Later Mesopotamian texts, however, consistently associate Eridu with the god Enki, and they identify Enki as the god responsible for transferring civilizational knowledge to humanity. Enki is the lord of the Abzu, the underground ocean where the me are stored. He is the god of wisdom, the god of craft, the god who teaches humanity how to build, how to farm, how to organise themselves into functioning societies. If Enki is the agent who lowered kingship to Eridu, and if Eridu is his cult city, then the king list is describing the establishment of a centre of divine instruction. Eridu is not simply the first city to receive kingship. It is the place where the transfer of civilizational knowledge began. It is the origin point from which the institution of kingship spread to other cities. This interpretation aligns with the structure of the antediluvian section. Kingship begins at Eridu. It then appears at Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak. The text does not describe how kingship moved from one city to another, but it implies a process of expansion. The institution that was lowered to Eridu is distributed across multiple centres, each with its own ruler, each participating in the same system of organised authority. The 5 antediluvian cities, then, are not isolated settlements. They are nodes in a network. They are connected by a shared institution and, presumably, by the trade routes, administrative systems, and cultural exchanges necessary to maintain that institution across multiple locations. The antediluvian period, as described in the king list, is not a time of scattered, primitive villages. It is a time of organised, interconnected cities governed by a common political framework. Is there archaeological evidence for such a network during the Ubaid period? To some extent, yes. The Ubaid pottery style, as mentioned earlier, is found across a wide geographic area, from the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia and even into the Levant and Anatolia. This distribution suggests extensive trade or movement of people carrying a shared cultural tradition. The pottery is not identical at every site. There are regional variations, but the core design elements are consistent, indicating cultural contact and possibly centralised production or distribution. The temple complexes at Ubaid period sites also show similarities in design and orientation, suggesting a shared religious tradition. The temples at Eridu, as noted, follow a consistent plan across multiple rebuilding phases. Temples at other Ubaid sites, such as Tepe Gara in northern Iraq, show similar architectural features. Central halls, altars, offering tables, buttressed walls. The consistency implies either direct transmission of architectural knowledge or participation in a common cultural system that dictated how sacred space should be organised. If the Ubaid culture represents a network of interconnected settlements with shared religious and architectural traditions, then it is not unreasonable to suggest that this network also had shared political structures. The temples themselves are evidence of organised labour and centralised decision-making. Someone determined where the temple would be built, how it would be designed, and how resources would be allocated for its construction. That someone, in Mesopotamian terms, would be a ruler, a figure with the authority to command labour and resources in service of the gods. The king list, by naming 5 antediluvian cities, are maybe preserving a memory of the most prominent centres in this network. Eridu, as the first, would be the origin point. The others, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurapak, would be secondary centres, places where kingship was established after its initial lowering to Eridu. The network existed, the flood disrupted it. And after the flood, the network was reconstituted with Kish as the new primary centre, followed by Uruk, Ur, and the succession of dynasties that eventually led to the historically attested rulers of the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia. This reading treats the king list as a distorted, but fundamentally historical record. It assumes that the cities named in the antediluvian section were real centres of political authority, that the institution of kingship was distributed across these centres in some organised way, and that the flood, whether a single catastrophic event or a series of severe flooding episodes, disrupted this system and required its reconstitution in a new form. The main obstacle to this reading is the chronology. The reign lengths assigned to the antediluvian kings are so extreme that they cannot be interpreted literally. 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years. These numbers do not correspond to any plausible human lifespan, or even to any plausible count of months or lunar cycles. They are, by any conventional measure, impossible. But impossibility does not necessarily mean meaninglessness. The numbers may encode information that has been lost or distorted through transmission. They may represent something other than individual lifespans, dynastic periods, generational counts, astronomical cycles, or symbolic values with theological significance. The problem is that without a key to decode them, the numbers remain opaque. They convey magnitude, a sense of great antiquity, but not precision. What can be said with more confidence is that the compilers of the King List believed they were recording a chronology that extended far back in time, well beyond the reach of contemporary memory or written documentation. They believed that kingship had been lowered to Eridu in this distant past, that it had been distributed across other cities, and that the flood had interrupted but not ended the sequence. Whether their belief was based on oral tradition, on older written sources now lost, or on theological conviction is impossible to determine from the text alone. What is clear is that the belief was widely shared. Either King List tradition is attested in multiple copies from multiple sites across several centuries. It was taught in scribal schools. It was referenced in royal inscriptions. It was part of the intellectual infrastructure of Mesopotamian civilization. And despite the obvious problems with the antediluvian chronology, no surviving Mesopotamian text challenges the King List's basic framework. No scribe added a note saying the antediluvian section was mythological or unreliable. No alternative chronology was proposed. The tradition was accepted, or at least it was accepted enough to be preserved and transmitted without significant alteration. This acceptance suggests that the Mesopotamians saw no fundamental contradiction between the antediluvian section and the rest of the King List. But they did not regard the flood as a boundary between myth and history. They regarded it as a boundary within history, a catastrophic event that divided the past into two periods, but did not erase the continuity of the institution that spanned both periods. Kingship existed before the flood. Kingship existed after the flood. The cities changed, the rulers changed, the reign lengths changed, but kingship itself persisted. The tablets from Nippur, copied by scribes trained in the service of Enlil's temple, embody this understanding. They preserve the King List not as a collection of myths, but as a chronological record, a framework for organising the past and legitimating the present. The antediluvian section is an integral part of that framework. It establishes the origin of kingship, situates that origin in a specific place, and extends the chronology back to a time when the gods were still actively involved in the governance of human affairs. Whether the gods were actually involved is a theological question, not a historical one. But the fact that the Mesopotamians believed they were involved, and that they structured their understanding of the past around that belief, is historically significant. It shaped how they thought about authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between human rulers and divine order, and it meant that any king who wanted to claim legitimate authority needed to situate himself within the chronological framework established by the King List, a framework that began not with human invention, but with divine transfer, not with gradual development, but with the lowering of kingship from heaven to Eridu. The King List, in this sense, is not just a record of rulers and dynasties. It is a political theology. It defines what kingship is, where it came from, and how it has been transmitted across time. And it does so by grounding the institution in a time before memory, a time when the gods still walked among humans, a time that can only be preserved in texts like this one, texts that insist, despite all the difficulties of interpretation, that there was something before the flood, and that what came after was not the beginning but the continuation. There is a stone stele in the Louvre, catalogued as A03835, known as the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. It was discovered at Susa in western Iran where it had been taken as war booty by Elamite raiders in the 12th century BCE, but it was originally carved in the 23rd century BCE to commemorate a military victory by Naram Sin, king of Akkad and grandson of Sargon the Great. The stele is made of pink limestone and stands over 2 meters tall. At its top is a carved image of Naram Sin ascending a mountain, trampling his enemies beneath his feet, while his soldiers follow behind him. Above his head are carved symbols representing celestial bodies, stars or planets. And Naram Sin himself wears a horned crown, a visual marker of divinity. The horned crown is significant. In Mesopotamian iconography, horns indicate divine status. Our gods wear horned crowns. Humans do not, with one exception: kings who have been deified. Naram Sin is one of the few Mesopotamian rulers known to have claimed divinity during his own lifetime. He did not merely rule by divine mandate. He claimed to be divine himself, a god walking among mortals, entitled to the same visual symbols and cultic worship that other gods received. This claim was controversial even in its own time, and later Mesopotamian tradition regarded Naram Sin's reign with ambivalence. Some texts praise his military achievements and his expansion of the Akkadian Empire. Other texts, particularly the so-called Curse of Akkad, describe his reign as a period of hubris and divine retribution. According to the Curse of Akkad, Naram Sin offended the god Enlil by attacking the temple at Nippur. And in response, Enlil sent the Gutians, a barbarian people from the mountains, to destroy the Akkadian Empire. Whether this account has any historical basis is debatable, but it reflects a persistent concern in Mesopotamian thought about the proper relationship between kings and gods. Kings were expected to serve the gods. They built temples, maintained cults, ensured the proper performance of rituals, and acted as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. In return, the gods granted them authority to rule. But that authority was conditional. A king who failed in his duties, who offended the gods, or who claimed too much for himself could lose divine favour, and with it, his legitimacy. The institution of kingship was stable, but individual kings were not. Kingship could be transferred from one ruler to another, either from one city to another, from one dynasty to another, depending on the will of the gods. This transferability is central to the structure of the king list. Kingship does not belong permanently to any single city or dynasty. It moves. It was lowered to Eridu. Then it moved to Bad Tibera, then to Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. After the flood, it moved to Kish, then to Uruk, then to Ur, then to Awan, and so on through a succession of cities and dynasties, each holding kingship for a time before it passed to the next. The movement of kingship is sometimes described in the text as a transfer, sometimes as a conquest. Some dynasties are listed as successive, implying that kingship passed peacefully or through divine decision from one city to another. Other dynasties are listed as contemporaneous, implying competition or conflict, and the overall impression is one of instability. Kingship does not remain in one place. It circulates among competing centres, each asserting its claim, each attempting to hold on to an institution that is, by its nature, transient. This understanding of kingship as transferable and impermanent is radically different from the concept of hereditary monarchy that developed in other parts of the ancient world. In Egypt, for example, kingship was understood as the permanent possession of a divine lineage. Pharaohs were gods by birth, and the throne passed from father to son within a single royal family that claimed descent from the gods. Breaks in the succession were treated as crises, periods of chaos that needed to be resolved by restoring the proper lineage. Mesopotamian kingship, by contrast, was not tied to a single lineage or a single city. It could be held by anyone whom the gods chose to favour, and it could be lost if divine favour was withdrawn. This made Mesopotamian politics inherently unstable. Cities competed for dominance. Dynasties rose and fell. And the king list, by documenting the succession of cities and dynasties, provided a framework for understanding this instability, not as chaos but as the normal functioning of a system in which kingship was meant to move. The question then is why kingship was designed to be transferable. If it was lowered from heaven as a stable institution, why was it not fixed in a single location? Why did it move from Eridu to Bad Tibira, from Bad Tibira to Larak, and so on? The text does not explain. It simply records the transfers as facts without providing reasons or justifications. And one possibility is that the transfers reflect real historical conflicts. Cities competed for resources, for trade routes, for agricultural land. Military victories shifted the balance of power. The city that controlled the most resources, or that had the most effective military, became the dominant centre, and with dominance came the claim to kingship. The king list in this reading is a record of shifting hegemonies, a chronicle of which cities held power at which times. Another possibility is that the transfers were ritualised rather than military. Kingship, as a divine institution, may have required periodic renewal through ceremonies conducted at specific sacred sites. If a city could successfully claim to be the site where kingship was renewed, it could assert its position as the current seat of legitimate authority. And the movement of kingship would then reflect not military conquest, but ritual competition, a contest to see which city could most effectively demonstrate its connection to divine favour. A third possibility, less commonly considered, is that the transfers were economic. Kingship required resources to sustain itself, grain to feed administrators and labourers, metals for tools and weapons, timber for construction, textiles for trade. If a city's economic base collapsed due to environmental changes, crop failures, or disruptions in trade, it could no longer support the institution of kingship. And kingship would move to a city with a more stable resource base. The king list in this reading is a record of economic shifts, documenting which cities had the capacity to sustain centralised authority at different points in time. All of these explanations are plausible, and none of them are mutually exclusive. The movement of kingship likely involved some combination of military, ritual, and economic factors. What is notable is that the king list treats these movements as part of a continuous sequence. Kingship does not disappear when it leaves one city. It reappears in another. The institution persists, even as the cities that house it change. This persistence across the flood boundary is particularly striking. The flood, according to the text, swept over the land. It destroyed the cities where kingship had been established. But kingship itself was not destroyed. It was lowered again from heaven, this time to Kish, and the sequence resumed. The implication is that kingship exists independently of the cities that hold it. It is not a product of any particular city's development. It is a transferable institution that can be moved, interrupted, and restored because it originates not from human effort, but from divine decision. This framework makes the flood less catastrophic than it might initially appear. Yes, the cities were destroyed. Yes, the antediluvian rulers were swept away. But the institution of kingship survived because it was never dependent on those specific cities or rulers. It was dependent on divine will, and divine will ensured its continuation by lowering it again after the flood. The catastrophe, in other words, was temporary. The institution was permanent. What this implies about the nature of the antediluvian cities is ambiguous. If kingship was established in those cities, they must have had the infrastructure to support it. Temples, administrative centres, storage facilities, workshops, irrigation systems. They must have had populations large enough to generate the agricultural surplus necessary to sustain a non-productive ruling class. They must have had craft specialists capable of producing the material goods, pottery, textiles, tools, weapons, that sustain trade and social differentiation. In short, they must have been complex, organised settlements, not simple villages. But if they were complex settlements, why were they so completely destroyed by the flood that kingship needed to be lowered again, rather than simply resuming in the same locations? Why didn't Eridu remain the seat of kingship after the waters receded? Why did kingship move to Kish instead? One answer is that the physical destruction was so severe that the antediluvian cities were uninhabitable after the flood. The buildings were ruined, the irrigation systems were washed away, the populations were decimated. Reconstruction would have been possible, but it would have required resources and labour that the survivors did not have. It was easier to establish kingship in a new location, in a city that had either been spared the worst effects of the flood or that recovered more quickly. Another answer is that the flood was understood not merely as a physical event, but as a divine judgment. The antediluvian cities, for reasons not specified in the king list, had lost divine favour. The flood was the mechanism by which that favour was withdrawn. Afterward, the gods chose a different city, Kish, as the new seat of kingship. Well, not because Eridu was physically uninhabitable, but because it was theologically disqualified. Kingship could not return to Eridu because Eridu had been rejected by the gods. This second interpretation aligns more closely with the narrative structure of the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh flood story, both of which describe the flood as a deliberate divine act intended to destroy humanity, or at least to reduce the human population to manageable levels. In both narratives, the flood is not a natural disaster, it is a theological event, an expression of divine will. And if the flood was a theological event, then the movement of kingship from the antediluvian cities to Kish after the flood would also be a theological decision, not a practical one. But whether the movement was practical or theological, the result is the same. Kingship did not return to Eridu. It was established at Kish, and from Kish it eventually moved to Uruk, and the other cities listed in the post-Diluvian section. The antediluvian cities faded from political prominence, though some of them, including Eridu and Shuruppak, continued to be inhabited and remained significant as religious sites. Eridu, in particular, retained its status as the cult centre of Enki and was revered throughout Mesopotamian history as a sacred place, even though it never again functioned as a political capital. The persistence of Eridu's religious significance is itself noteworthy. If the city had been completely destroyed by the flood and abandoned afterward, one would not expect it to retain such a prominent place in Mesopotamian religious thought. But Eridu continued to be regarded as the primordial city, the place where civilization began, the seat of Enki's temple, and the repository of sacred knowledge. This suggests that while Eridu may have lost its political function after the flood, it retained its symbolic and religious function, and the memory of its primacy was preserved in texts like the King List and in ongoing cultic activity at the site. The same is true, to a lesser extent, of Shuruppak. The city is remembered as the home of the flood hero, the place where Utnapishtim or Atrahasis received the warning to build a boat. It is the last antediluvian city in the King List, the final seat of kingship before the flood swept over. And even though Shuruppak, like Eridu, did not regain political prominence after the flood, it remained a site of memory, a place associated with the transition from the antediluvian world to the post-flood world. These patterns of memory, persistent religious significance despite loss of political function, suggest that the antediluvian cities were not forgotten after the flood. They were remembered, and they were remembered in specific ways, as the places where kingship had first been established, as the seats of divine authority, as the locations where the institutions of civilization had been lowered from heaven. The fact that they were remembered in this way, across centuries and across changes in political power, indicates that their role in the chronological framework of Mesopotamian history was considered important, even after they ceased to function as political centres. The victory stele of Naram Sin, with its image of a king wearing the horned crown of divinity, is a visual reminder of the theological dimensions of Mesopotamian kingship. Kings did not rule by human authority alone. They ruled because they had been chosen by the gods, and their legitimacy depended on maintaining the favour of those gods. The king list by tracing the succession of kingship from its divine origin in Eridu through the catastrophe of the flood and into the historical dynasties, provides the chronological framework within which that legitimacy was understood. Naram-Sin's claim to divinity was an extreme expression of royal authority, and it was ultimately rejected by later tradition. But the underlying principle, that kingship was a divine gift lowered from heaven, are transferable among cities and rulers according to divine will, remained central to Mesopotamian political thought. And that principle required a chronology that extended back to the beginning, back to the moment when kingship first descended to Eridu and the antediluvian world began. In the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, there is a clay tablet catalogued as Ni 3191, excavated from Nippur and dating to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. The tablet is part of a collection of literary texts copied in the scribal schools of Nippur, and it contains a composition known as the Eridu Genesis, or the Sumerian flood story. The text is fragmentary, portions are missing, and what remains is often difficult to interpret, but it preserves an account of creation, the establishment of cities, and the coming of the flood that predates the more famous Akkadian versions found in the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Eridu Genesis begins, as far as can be reconstructed from the damaged text, with a description of the creation of humanity and the founding of the first cities. The gods are named, yet the establishment of kingship is mentioned. And then the text describes how the human population grew, how cities were built, and how the noise of humanity became unbearable to the gods. The solution, as in the later Akkadian versions, is a flood. But before the flood, the text names specific cities that existed in this early period. The cities it names are the same cities that appear in the antediluvian section of the king list: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. This correspondence is significant. The Eridu Genesis is not a king list, it is a narrative. It tells a story with characters, events, and a plot structure. But despite being a different genre of text, it preserves the same tradition about which cities existed before the flood. The tradition is not unique to the king list. It appears across multiple texts, or in multiple forms, indicating that the association between these 5 cities and the antediluvian period was widespread and well established in Mesopotamian thought. The Eridu Genesis also provides additional details not found in the king list. It describes the institution of kingship as something given by the gods to organise human society. It mentions the construction of temples and the establishment of religious rituals. It describes the flood not as a sudden, arbitrary event, but as the culmination of a process. Humanity grows too numerous, the noise becomes intolerable, the gods decide to act. The flood is presented as a response to a specific problem, not as a random catastrophe. What is missing from the Eridu Genesis, as from the king list, is any description of how the cities came to be in the first place. The text does not describe the process of urbanization. It does not explain how small agricultural settlements grew into cities. It does not trace the development of craft specialization, trade networks, or social hierarchies. The cities simply exist, already established, already functioning, when the narrative begins. And the gods, seeing that cities exist, decide to organise them by establishing kingship. This narrative structure, cities already existing when kingship is established, mirrors the structure of the king list, which also begins not with the founding of cities but with the lowering of kingship to cities that are already in place. Both texts assume that cities precede kingship, but neither explains where the cities came from. The origin of cities, like the origin of so many other elements of Mesopotamian civilization, is left unnarrated. One possible explanation for this omission is that the Mesopotamians did not regard the founding of cities as particularly important or interesting. Cities were simply where people lived. What mattered was not the physical existence of cities, but the organisation of cities under centralized authority. The king list and the Eridu Genesis are concerned with political and theological structures, not with material culture or settlement patterns. They document the establishment of kingship, the distribution of divine favour, the relationships between cities and gods. The mundane details of how cities were built are irrelevant to these concerns. Another explanation is that the founding of cities was so far in the past that no memory of it remained. By the time the king list and the Eridu Genesis were composed, cities had been a feature of the Mesopotamian landscape for so long that their origins were simply unknown. The texts begin with what was remembered or believed, not with what had been forgotten. And what was remembered was that kingship was lowered to cities that already existed, that 5 cities in particular were prominent before the flood, and that the flood marked a boundary between an earlier phase of civilization and a later phase. A third explanation, less commonly advanced, is that cities were not founded by the people who lived in them, but were established by an outside agency. If kingship was lowered from heaven, it is possible that the cities themselves were also established through divine agency, or through the agency of intermediaries acting on behalf of the gods. In this reading, the Mesopotamians did not have an origin story for cities because they believed cities were not invented by humans. They were given, just as kingship was given, as part of the transfer of civilization from the divine realm to the human realm. This interpretation aligns with the broader pattern of Mesopotamian thought, in which the fundamental elements of civilization, writing, agriculture, law, metalworking, temple building, are all attributed to divine instruction rather than human invention. The gods teach humanity how to live. Humanity does not figure it out on its own. And if the gods teach humanity how to build cities, then the founding of cities is not a human achievement, but a divine one, which would explain why it is not celebrated or even described in the mythological literature. The Eridu Genesis, fragmentary as it is, reinforces this understanding. The text moves quickly from creation to the establishment of cities to the institution of kingship to the flood. The transitions are abrupt. There is no sense of gradual development or organic growth. Things happen because the gods decide they should happen. Cities exist because the gods ordain their existence. Kingship is established because the gods lower it from heaven. The flood occurs because the gods determine that humanity needs to be reduced. Human agency is minimal. Divine agency is total. This theological framework leaves little room for the kind of historical narrative that modern readers expect. There are no inventors, no pioneers, no gradual accumulation of knowledge. There is only the will of the gods and the actions of humans responding to that will. And because the gods are not bound by human limitations, their actions do not need to be explained or justified. They simply are. But even within this theological framework, certain details stand out as potentially historical. The 5 cities named in the antediluvian section, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are not arbitrary selections. They are specific places, and with the exception of Larak, whose identification remains uncertain, they correspond to known archaeological sites. These sites have been excavated, and they have yielded evidence of occupation during the periods that conventional chronology places in the late prehistoric and early historic phases of Mesopotamian civilization. Eridu, as already discussed, has a long sequence of temple construction dating back to the Ubaid period. Shuruppak has yielded large quantities of administrative tablets from the mid-3rd millennium BCE, indicating a functioning bureaucracy. Sippar, identified with Tel Abu Haba, was a major city in later periods, and was known as the cult centre of the sun god Shamash. Bad Tibira's exact function in the early periods is less clear, but its name appears in multiple sources, indicating that it was a recognised and significant settlement. The fact that these cities are named consistently across different texts, in the king list, in the Eridu Genesis, and in later references, suggests that their association with the antediluvian period was not a literary invention, but a preserved tradition. The tradition may have been distorted, embellished, or reinterpreted over time, but it rested on something older than the texts themselves. And it rested on a memory, however vague, of a time when these cities were the primary centres of organised settlement in southern Mesopotamia. What that memory preserves is open to interpretation. It could be a memory of the Ubaid period, when Eridu and other sites were prominent temple centres. It could be a memory of an even earlier period, if one is willing to entertain the possibility that the chronology of the king list, however distorted, points to something before the conventionally dated Ubaid. Or it could be a memory of a network of cities that existed before a major flooding event or series of flooding events disrupted the region and required the reorganisation of settlement patterns. The Eridu Genesis, unlike the king list, includes a character who survives the flood. He is called Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, and in the Akkadian versions he is called Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The name changes across texts, but the role remains the same. He is the flood hero, the man who is warned by the god Enki to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all living things. After the flood, he makes a sacrifice to the gods, and in return he is granted immortality and is allowed to live in a remote, paradisiacal location at the edge of the world. Ziusudra's survival is crucial to the narrative logic of the flood story. If the flood destroyed all of humanity, there would be no one left to remember what came before. The antediluvian period would be lost entirely. But because Ziusudra survives, the memory of the antediluvian world is preserved. He carries it across the boundary of the flood, and through him, the knowledge of what existed before, the cities, the kingship, the divine institutions, is transmitted to the post-flood world. This transmission of knowledge is implicit in the structure of the king list. The list does not restart after the flood. It continues. The post-flood kings are listed in the same format as the antediluvian kings, using the same terminology, the same enumeration style. The implication is that the compilers of the king list had access to information about the antediluvian period, even though that period was separated from their own time by the catastrophic boundary of the flood. How did they have this information? The narrative logic of the flood story suggests an answer. They had it because someone survived the flood and preserved the memory. Whether Ziusudra is a historical figure is impossible to determine, and the texts treat him as an individual, a specific person with a name and a story, but he may equally be a symbolic representation of cultural continuity, a figure who stands for the preservation of memory across catastrophic disruption. In either case, his function in the narrative is the same. He ensures that the antediluvian world is not forgotten. He is the bridge between before and after. The king list does not name Ziusudra. It does not include him in its enumeration of rulers, but the fact that the list continues after the flood, and the fact that it treats the post-flood period as a continuation rather than a new beginning, implies that knowledge of the antediluvian period was available to the compilers. They knew or believed they knew which cities had held kingship before the flood. They knew or believed they knew, like the names of the rulers who had governed those cities, and they recorded this information as part of a single, continuous, chronological framework. The Eridu Genesis, by including both the flood and the survival of Ziusudra, makes this continuity explicit. The flood is a disruption, but it is not a total erasure. Something is carried across the boundary. Memory persists. And because memory persists, the institutions that existed before the flood, kingship, temple worship, divine authority, can be re-established after the flood. The post-flood world is not starting from scratch. It is rebuilding something that was lost, restoring an order that was temporarily destroyed. This understanding of the flood as disruption rather than obliteration is consistent with the archaeological evidence. In southern Mesopotamia experienced significant flooding events during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Some sites were abandoned temporarily. Others show evidence of destruction followed by rebuilding. But the region as a whole did not revert to an uninhabited state. Settlement continued, cultural traditions were maintained. And by the time writing appears in the archaeological record, around 3200 BCE, in conventional chronology, the administrative systems visible in the earliest tablets are already sophisticated, indicating that they rest on earlier, unwritten precedents. The question is whether those unwritten precedents include the antediluvian institutions described in the King List and the Eridu Genesis. Did kingship, in some form, exist before the flood? Were Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak centres of organised authority before a catastrophic flooding event disrupted the region? Or are these texts projecting later institutions backward onto a mythological past, creating a false continuity where none exists? The texts themselves cannot answer this question. They assert continuity, but they do not prove it. What they do prove is that the Mesopotamians believed in this continuity. They believed that kingship was lowered to Eridu before the flood. They believed that the 5 antediluvian cities were real centres of authority. They believed that the flood interrupted, but did not destroy the institution of kingship. And they structured their entire understanding of political legitimacy around this belief. Whether the belief was accurate is a different question, and it is a question that requires evidence beyond the texts themselves. It requires archaeology, geology, comparative mythology, linguistic analysis, any method that can shed light on what southern Mesopotamia was like during the periods that might correspond to the antediluvian chronology. The texts provide a framework. They assert a claim, but the evaluation of that claim depends on sources that the texts do not control. The Eridu Genesis tablet, damaged and incomplete, rests in its museum case in Istanbul. It preserves a story that was already old when it was copied in 1800 BCE. The story was told, retold, and eventually written down because it was considered important, because it addressed fundamental questions about where humanity came from, where cities came from, where kingship came from, and what the relationship between gods and humans was meant to be. The answers it provides are theological, but they are grounded in specific places: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and they insist on a chronology that extends back before the flood, back to a time when these places were the seats of authority, and the gods still lowered kingship from heaven. There is a concept in Mesopotamian thought that has no precise equivalent in modern language. The term is me, written in cuneiform, as a simple sign that looks like a collection of small wedges, arranged in a specific pattern. The me are not objects, though they are sometimes described as if they were physical things that could be carried, stolen, or transferred. They are not laws, though they govern behaviour and establish order. They are not abstract principles, though they operate at a level removed from material reality. The me are best understood as the fundamental powers or decrees that make civilization possible, the divine blueprints for every aspect of organised human existence. The me include kingship, they include priesthood, they include writing, music, metalworking, leatherworking, pottery, weaving, agriculture, animal husbandry, trade, warfare, law, justice, sexual intercourse, prostitution, falsehood, and dozens of other elements. Some lists enumerate more than 60 me. Others mention over 100. The exact number varies across text, but the concept remains consistent. The me are pre-existing patterns, established by the gods, and human civilization consists of implementing these patterns in the earthly realm. What makes the me significant for understanding the King List and the antediluvian cities is that the me are not invented by humans. They exist prior to their implementation. They are stored in the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that lies beneath the earth, and they are guarded by the god Enki, whose temple at Eridu was believed to stand directly above the Abzu. Enki possesses the me, he controls access to them, and according to various myths, he is responsible for transferring them from the divine realm to human cities. The myth of Inanna and Enki, preserved in multiple copies from the old Babylonian period, describes how the goddess Inanna travelled to Eridu to visit Enki in his temple. Enki, pleased by her visit, offered her beer. As he became increasingly drunk, he began giving her the me, one by one, as gifts. Inanna accepted them all. Over 60 me are listed in the text, and loaded them onto her boat. She then sailed away, heading back to her own city of Uruk. When Enki sobered up and realised what he had done, he sent his servant to retrieve the me, but Inanna refused to return them. She brought them to Uruk, and Uruk became a centre of civilization, because it now possessed the divine blueprints for civilized life. The narrative is clearly mythological. Gods getting drunk and making decisions they later regret is a common motif in ancient Near Eastern literature. But beneath the humour and the narrative drama, the myth encodes a serious theological claim. Civilization is not invented by humans through trial and error. It is received from the gods. The me exist before they are implemented. They are transferred, not created. And once a city possesses the me, it has the capacity to function as a centre of organised, complex society. Eridu, as Enki's cult city and the location of his primary temple, is understood in this framework as the original repository of the me. Before Inanna took some of them to Uruk, all the me were at Eridu, stored in the Abzu beneath Enki's temple. This makes Eridu not just the first city to receive kingship, as the king list claims, but the original source of all civilizational knowledge. Everything that makes civilization possible, every technology, every institution, every social practice, originates at Eridu because Eridu is where the me are stored and where Enki, their guardian, resides. This understanding of Eridu as the source of civilization is consistent across multiple Mesopotamian texts. Eridu is called the first city. It is described as the place where the cosmic order was first established on Earth. It is the city where the boundary between the divine and human realms is thinnest, where communication between gods and humans is most direct, and where the transfer of divine knowledge to humanity originally occurred. If this is the case, then the lowering of kingship to Eridu, as described in the king list, is part of a larger process, the transfer of the me from the Abzu to the earthly realm. Kingship is one of the me. It was stored in the Abzu along with all the others, and at some point, the gods decided to implement kingship on Earth, and they chose Eridu as the location where this implementation would begin. The king list, by stating that kingship was lowered to Eridu, is describing the moment when this particular me was transferred from the divine realm to human society. But if kingship is a me, and if me are transferable, then kingship can move. It can be taken from one city and given to another, just as Inanna took some of the me from Eridu and brought them to Uruk. This explains the structure of the king list, with its succession of cities holding kingship for varying periods before it passes to the next city. Kingship moves because me, by their nature, can be transferred, and the city that possesses kingship at any given time is the city that the gods have chosen to favour. The antediluvian section of the king list, in this framework, represents the initial distribution of kingship among multiple cities. After kingship was lowered to Eridu, it was extended to Bat-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. These cities received kingship not because they conquered it militarily, and not because they developed it independently, but because the gods decided to distribute the me of kingship among multiple centres. Each city became a seat of authority, because each city was granted a portion of the divine power that makes authority possible. The flood, then, represents a withdrawal of this divine favour, and the gods decided that the distribution of the me needed to be revised. The antediluvian cities lost their possession of kingship, and after the flood, kingship was lowered again, this time to Kish, and a new distribution began. The institution itself was not destroyed. It was recalled, stored temporarily in the divine realm, and then reissued to a different set of cities under new conditions. This theological explanation for the movement of kingship has practical implications. If kingship is understood as a divine gift that can be given and taken away, then the legitimacy of any particular king depends not on his own achievements or on his lineage, but on whether the gods continue to favour him. A king who loses divine favour loses his right to rule, even if he retains military power or popular support. Legitimacy is theological, not practical. And the king list, by documenting the succession of cities that have held kingship, is documenting the shifting patterns of divine favour over time. This makes the king list a theological text as much as a historical one. It is not simply recording which cities held power. It is interpreting the meaning of political change through a theological framework. When kingship moves from one city to another, the king list is saying it is because the gods have decided to transfer their favour. The political history of Mesopotamia is therefore also a religious history, a record of divine decisions made manifest in earthly events. The problem with this interpretation is that it assumes the gods exist and that they actively intervene in human affairs. Modern scholarship, operating within a secular framework, and they cannot accept this assumption, but it can recognise that the Mesopotamians themselves believed in divine intervention, and that this belief shaped how they understood their own history. The king list is a product of that belief. It is written from within a worldview in which gods are real, in which divine decisions determine political outcomes, and in which the movement of kingship from city to city is not random but purposeful, reflecting the will of the gods who lowered kingship from heaven in the first place. Whether the gods actually exist is not a question the king list attempts to answer. It simply assumes their existence and proceeds from that assumption. The text is not trying to prove that the gods are real. It is trying to document what the gods have done. They lowered kingship to Eridu, they distributed it among other cities, they sent the flood to interrupt the distribution, and they restored kingship to Kish after the flood so that the process could continue. What this means for the antediluvian cities is that they were not ordinary settlements. They were places where the me had been implemented, where divine power was actively manifest in earthly form. Eridu, as the first seat of kingship, was the primary centre of this manifestation. The other antediluvian cities, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurapak, were secondary centres, extensions of the original transfer that occurred at Eridu. Together they formed a network of divinely authorised settlements, places where the order established by the gods was being carried out by human rulers acting under divine mandate. The flood destroyed these settlements. It interrupted the network, and it broke the connection between the divine realm and the earthly centres where divine authority had been implemented. But it did not destroy the me themselves, because the me exist independently of their earthly manifestations. The me were recalled to the Abzu, stored again in the repository beneath Enki's temple, and then redistributed when the gods decided it was time to restore civilization. Kingship was lowered again to Kish. Other me were distributed to other cities. And the post-flood world gradually rebuilt itself, not by inventing new institutions, but by re-implementing the same divine patterns that had existed before the flood. This understanding of civilization, as the implementation of pre-existing divine patterns, is fundamentally different from the modern understanding of civilization as a human achievement. In the modern view, the humans invent writing, develop agriculture, create legal systems, establish political hierarchies. These are products of human ingenuity, human labour, human creativity. In the Mesopotamian view, humans implement what the gods have already designed. They execute divine blueprints. They act as the agents of divine will, not as independent creators. This does not mean that Mesopotamians believed humans were passive or unintelligent. The myths are full of clever humans who solve problems, build things, and make decisions. But the fundamental structures, the me, are given, not invented. And kingship, as one of the me, is not something that emerges from human social evolution. It is something that descends from heaven, is implemented on earth, and moves from city to city according to divine will. The king list, by beginning with the lowering of kingship from heaven, and by documenting its movement across cities and across the boundary of the flood, is providing a record of this process. It is not a neutral, objective chronicle. It is a theological interpretation of political history, a text that reads the succession of dynasties as evidence of divine action. Every time kingship moves, the text is saying, the gods have made a decision. Every city that holds kingship does so because the gods have chosen to favour it. And every city that loses kingship does so because the gods have withdrawn their favour. The antediluvian section, in this light, is not an anomaly. It is the beginning of the pattern. Kingship was lowered to Eridu. It was distributed among other cities. The flood interrupted the pattern. Kingship was restored to Kish. And the pattern resumed. The entire structure of the king list from the antediluvian period through the historical dynasties is a record of this repetitive process. Divine favour granted, divine favour maintained, divine favour withdrawn, divine favour restored. What remains unclear is why the gods decided to distribute kingship in the specific way the king list describes. Why Eridu first? Why Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak next? Why Kish after the flood and not one of the antediluvian cities? The text provides no explanations. It simply records the sequence and leaves the reader to infer the reasons. One possibility is that the sequence reflects real historical patterns that were later interpreted theologically. Cities rose and fell in prominence due to economic, military, or environmental factors, and these shifts in prominence were understood by later generations as evidence of divine favour moving from place to place. The king list would then be a theological reading of historical events, an attempt to make sense of political change by attributing it to divine will. Another possibility is that the sequence is entirely theological, constructed to reflect beliefs about which gods were most important and which cities were most sacred. Eridu is first because it is Enki's city, and because Enki is the god who guards the me. The other antediluvian cities are included because they have their own divine patrons and their own roles in the cosmic order. Kish becomes the first post-flood city because it is associated with Enlil, the chief god, whose favour is necessary for any king to rule successfully. A third possibility is that the sequence preserves a genuine memory of settlement patterns and political organisation from a very early period, but that this memory has been filtered through theological interpretation and has been distorted in the process. The cities named are real places. Their prominence may reflect actual historical periods when they were centres of authority. But the chronology has been stretched, the rulers have been mythologised, and the entire framework has been recast in theological terms to serve the political and religious needs of later Mesopotamian civilization. None of these possibilities can be proven from the text alone. The king list makes claims, but it does not provide the evidence necessary to evaluate those claims. It assumes that its readers will accept its framework, that kingship was lowered from heaven, that it moved among cities, that the flood interrupted the process, that kingship was restored afterward, because that framework is consistent with the broader theological worldview that the readers inhabit. It is a text written for believers, not for skeptics, but even if one does not accept the theological framework, the text remains significant. It preserves a tradition about which cities were considered ancient and important. It documents a belief in continuity across the flood boundary. It reflects a way of thinking about political authority that was dominant in Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, and it raises questions that cannot be easily dismissed. Why were these specific cities remembered? And why was their association with the antediluvian period so stable across different texts? And what does it mean that the Mesopotamians believed their civilization did not begin after the flood, but was restored after the flood, implying that something substantial existed before? The me, as divine patterns, exist outside of time. They were present before the antediluvian period. They persisted through the flood, and they continue into the historical period. They are the unchanging foundation beneath the shifting surface of political history. And kingship, as one of these me, participates in this timelessness. It is lowered, distributed, interrupted, and restored. But it is never created, and it is never destroyed. It simply moves following the will of the gods who established it in the first place. There is a question that the king list raises but never answers. It is a question that sits quietly beneath the surface of the text, implicit in its structure but never made explicit in its wording. The question is this: if kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu, at the beginning, what existed before that moment? What was the state of human society before the gods decided to impose centralised authority? What did the world look like before kingship descended? The text is silent on this point. It begins with the lowering of kingship, and it assumes that this moment is the beginning of everything that matters. There is no description of a pre-kingship world. There is no account of what humans were doing before the gods organised them into cities and placed rulers over them. And the king list treats the lowering of kingship as a starting point, not as a transition from one state to another. Before kingship, as far as the text is concerned, there is nothing worth recording. This silence is consistent across Mesopotamian literature. Texts that deal with the creation of humanity describe the moment when humans are fashioned from clay and divine blood. Texts that deal with the establishment of civilization describe the moment when the gods lower the me from heaven. But the period between the creation of humanity and the establishment of civilization is largely absent from the mythological record. It is as though this period either did not exist or was so brief, so insignificant, that it left no trace in cultural memory. One explanation for this silence is that the Mesopotamians did not conceive of a lengthy transitional period between the creation of humanity and the establishment of civilization. In their understanding, humans were created for a specific purpose, to perform the labour that the gods no longer wished to perform themselves. This purpose required organisation. It required cities, agriculture, irrigation, temples, and all the other infrastructure of civilized life. And it required kingship to coordinate and direct these activities. The creation of humanity and the establishment of civilization were therefore part of a single process, not separate events separated by millennia of gradual development. If this is the case, then the lowering of kingship to Eridu was not the imposition of order on a chaotic, pre-existing human population. It was the activation of the social structure for which humans had been created. Humans were made to live in cities under centralised authority. The lowering of kingship was simply the implementation of the design according to which humans had been fashioned. There was no pre-civilized phase because humans were not designed to exist in a pre-civilized state. This interpretation aligns with the absence of invention myths in Mesopotamian literature. Writing is not invented, it is one of the me given by the gods. Agriculture is not invented, it is taught by Enki or by other divine instructors. Metalworking, law, temple building, none of these are presented as human discoveries. They are all divine gifts, transferred from the gods to humanity as part of the package of civilization. And if civilization as a whole is a divine gift, then there is no need to explain how humans developed it on their own, because they did not develop it. It was given to them, fully formed, when kingship was lowered from heaven. But this raises another question. If civilization was given to humans rather than developed by them, what does that imply about the nature of the antediluvian cities? If Eridu received kingship directly from the gods, and if kingship came as part of a complete package of civilizational knowledge, then Eridu should have appeared as a fully functioning city, with temples, administrative structures, writing, agriculture, and all the other elements of complex society. From the moment kingship was lowered, there should be no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. There should be a sudden appearance of complexity, a moment when civilization emerges without obvious precursors. The archaeological evidence does not support this scenario, at least not in the extreme form that a literal reading of the texts would suggest. Eridu's earliest levels show simple structures that become more complex over time. There is a developmental sequence, not a sudden appearance of full complexity. The same is true at other early Mesopotamian sites. Uruk develops over centuries from a small settlement to a massive urban centre. The invention of writing can be traced through a sequence of increasingly abstract symbols. Agriculture shows evidence of gradual domestication of plants and animals. Nothing appears fully formed, but the absence of sudden appearance does not necessarily invalidate the theological claim. It may simply mean that the lowering of kingship was not a single moment but a process, or that the implementation of the me took time, even though the me themselves existed prior to their implementation. The gods may have lowered kingship to Eridu, but the construction of temples, the training of priests, the establishment of administrative systems, the development of writing, all of these would have required time, even if the knowledge of how to do them was divinely provided. Alternatively, the developmental sequence visible in the archaeological record may reflect not the invention of civilization, but the rebuilding of civilization after an earlier disruption. If the antediluvian cities existed before the conventionally dated Ubaid period, and if they were destroyed by flooding or some other catastrophe, then the Ubaid period structures at Eridu and elsewhere might represent not the beginning of civilization, but the restoration of civilization. The gradual increase in complexity would then reflect not invention, but recovery, the slow process of rebuilding what had been lost. This interpretation is speculative, and it is not the mainstream view, but it is consistent with the structure of the king list, which insists that kingship was lowered twice, once before the flood, and again after the flood. If kingship was lowered twice, it implies that the post-flood lowering was not the introduction of something new, but the restoration of something that had existed previously. The gods did not have to explain to the post-flood population what kingship was or how it functioned. They simply re-established it, and the post-flood cities implemented it in the same way the antediluvian cities had. The question of what existed before the first lowering of kingship, however, remains unanswered. The king list does not go back beyond this point. It does not describe a pre-kingship world. And if the Mesopotamians believed that humans were created specifically to live under kingship, then there may be no pre-kingship world to describe. Humans and kingship may have been conceived as coeval, emerging together when the gods decided to transfer the burden of labour from the divine realm to the earthly realm. But there is a tension here that the texts do not fully resolve. On the one hand, kingship is lowered from heaven, implying that it comes from outside, that it is imposed on a pre-existing population. On the other hand, humans are created for the purpose of labour, which implies organisation, which implies authority, which implies something like kingship. If humans were created to work, they needed to be organised. And if they were organised from the moment of their creation, then kingship, or something functionally similar, must have existed from the beginning, even if it was not formally lowered to a specific city until later. One way to resolve this tension is to distinguish between informal and formal authority. Humans may have been organised from the moment of their creation, but this organisation was informal, temporary, or localised. The lowering of kingship to Eridu represents the formalisation of authority, the establishment of a permanent, centralised, divinely sanctioned institution. Before this moment, there may have been leaders, elders, or coordinators who directed labour and made decisions. But these individuals did not hold kingship in the formal sense. They were not invested with divine authority. They were not part of a recognised political institution. The lowering of kingship created that institution, transforming informal authority into formal, legitimate rule. This distinction between informal and formal authority may explain why the king list begins where it does. It is not interested in documenting every instance of human organisation. It is interested in documenting the succession of legitimate rulers, and legitimacy requires divine sanction. Kings before the lowering of kingship, if they existed at all, would not be legitimate in the theological sense. They would not be part of the divinely ordained succession, and therefore they would not be included in the king list. The king list, in other words, is not a complete history of human political organisation. It is a record of divinely sanctioned kingship, beginning with the moment when that institution was first established on Earth. Everything before that moment, whether it involved human leaders or not, falls outside the scope of the text. The king list is concerned only with what the gods have authorized, and the gods authorized kingship when they lowered it to Eridu. This understanding of the text has implications for how the antediluvian section should be interpreted. The rulers listed in that section, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, and the others, are not simply powerful individuals who happen to control cities. They are the first holders of divinely sanctioned authority. And they are the first kings in the theological sense, the first humans to rule with explicit divine approval. Their inclusion in the king list signifies that they were part of the legitimate succession, the unbroken chain of divinely authorized rule that extends from the lowering of kingship to the present day. The flood interrupts this chain, but it does not break it. Kingship is lowered again after the flood, and the succession resumes. The post-flood kings are part of the same chain as the antediluvian kings. The institution is continuous even though the cities and rulers change, and the king list, by documenting this continuity, asserts that legitimate authority in Mesopotamia is not a human creation. It is a divine gift, lowered from heaven at the beginning, interrupted by the flood, restored afterward, and maintained through the succession of dynasties down to the time when the text was written. This is a powerful theological claim, and it served important political functions. Any king who wanted to assert his legitimacy needed to situate himself within this succession. He needed to demonstrate that he held kingship not through conquest or popular support alone, but through divine favour. The king list provided the framework for making this demonstration. It showed that kingship had a history, that it had been held by specific cities in a specific sequence, and that the current king was part of that sequence, the latest in a line extending back to the moment when kingship first descended to Eridu. But the claim also has implications that go beyond politics. It implies that civilization itself is not a human achievement, but a divine gift. It implies that the fundamental institutions of organised society, kingship, law, temple worship, writing, and all the rest, do not emerge from human creativity, but are transferred from the divine realm to the earthly realm. It implies that humans are implementing a design they did not create, following patterns they did not invent, living within a framework they did not construct. This is a profoundly different way of understanding human existence than the one that dominates modern thought. In the modern view, humans are the authors of their own societies. They invent, they innovate, they create. Social institutions emerge from human needs and human decisions. In the Mesopotamian view, humans are the implementers of divine will. They execute, they maintain, they participate in structures that were designed by the gods. The credit for civilization does not belong to humanity. It belongs to the gods who lowered kingship from heaven and who continue to oversee its distribution among cities. The king list encodes this worldview in its structure. It begins with a divine act, the lowering of kingship. It proceeds through a sequence of rulers who hold authority by divine sanction. It acknowledges the catastrophic interruption of the flood, but insists that the institution survived because the gods chose to restore it. And it concludes, in its various versions, with the dynasties of the period in which the text was written, asserting that these dynasties are part of the same continuous succession that began at Eridu in the time before memory. What this means for someone reading the text today, thousands of years removed from the culture that produced it, is that the king list cannot be understood purely as a historical document. It is a theological statement masquerading as a chronicle. It makes historical claims. These cities existed, these rulers held power, these events occurred, but it frames those claims within a theological interpretation that attributes all political change to divine will. The cities are real, the rulers may be real, but the framework that connects them is theological, not empirical. This does not mean the king list is worthless as a historical source. It means that extracting historical information from it requires distinguishing between the events it records and the interpretation it imposes on those events. The list of cities is probably reliable. The sequence of dynasties, at least in the later sections, corresponds reasonably well with other evidence. But the existence of a major flooding event or events is supported by archaeology and geology. But the claim that kingship was lowered from heaven, that it moved from city to city according to divine will, that it survived the flood because the gods chose to restore it, these are theological interpretations, not historical facts. The question is whether anything lies beneath the theological interpretation. Is there a core of historical memory preserved in the antediluvian section? Or is that section purely mythological, a projection backward of later institutions onto an imagined past? The text itself cannot answer this question. It presents the antediluvian section in the same format as the historical section, using the same terminology, the same enumeration style, the same matter-of-fact tone. It does not mark the antediluvian section as different in kind. It treats it as part of the same continuous record. Whether that treatment is justified depends on evidence external to the king list. It depends on whether archaeology can confirm the existence of complex, organised settlements at the sites named in the antediluvian section, during periods that might correspond, even roughly, to a pre-flood chronology. It depends on whether geological evidence supports the occurrence of catastrophic flooding at the right time and in the right places. It depends on whether comparative analysis of flood traditions from other cultures reveals a common origin in historical events. And it depends on whether the chronology, however distorted, preserves any recoverable information about the actual time periods involved. These are empirical questions, and they require empirical investigation. The king list provides a starting point. It names cities. It describes a sequence. It asserts continuity across a catastrophic boundary. But it does not provide proof. It provides a claim that must be evaluated against other forms of evidence, evidence that the Mesopotamians themselves did not have access to, and that modern scholarship is only beginning to assemble. What remains, after all the questions and uncertainties, is the text itself. Clay tablets and prisms inscribed with careful cuneiform, preserved across millennia, now housed in museums where they can be examined but not fully explained. The king list makes a simple assertion. Kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu. It was distributed among cities. The flood interrupted it, and it was restored afterward. The assertion is repeated across multiple copies, across multiple centuries, with minor variations but fundamental consistency. The Mesopotamians believed this was true. They taught it in their schools. They referenced it in their royal inscriptions. They structured their understanding of political legitimacy around it. Whether it was actually true is a question the text does not address. It assumes truth. It asserts truth. And it leaves the evaluation of that truth to those who come after, to those who must decide what weight to give to a tradition preserved with such care across such vast stretches of time. A tradition that insists, against all modern assumptions, that civilization did not begin after the flood, but was restored after the flood, implying that something substantial, something organised, and something that deserved to be called kingship existed before. The king list does not demand belief, it simply records. And in recording, it preserves a question that has never been fully answered. What existed before the flood? And how much of what we think we know about the beginning of civilization is actually the story of its restoration?